If you want to understand the Soviet Union, don't start with ideology, start with Moscow. Because here, power wasn't just exercised, it was built in concrete. From Lenin's experiments, to Stalin's monumental skyline, to Khrushchev's housing revolution, to Brezhnev's endless suburbs, Moscow became the testing ground for one of the most ambitious social experiments in history. Welcome to Moot. In this episode, we explore Moscow from 1917 to 1991 and ask how a city was used to reshape the past, control the present, and design the future. March 1918, just months after the revolution, the Soviet government moved the capital from Petrograd back to Moscow. Officially, it was about security, but symbolically, it meant much more. After all, why leave Petrograd, the city where the revolution began? Because the two cities stood for very different futures. Petrograd was Peter the Great's window to Europe, a city designed to look west and imitate it. Moscow was different, older, heavier, shaped by both east and west. That in-between character mirrored Russia itself. In simple terms, Petrograd was Peter's dream, Moscow became Lenin's reality. Moving the capital was a declaration. The Soviet state would stop imitating the West and start inventing its own path. From then on, Moscow became a laboratory for socialism. This was the moment when Soviet avant-garde architecture was born. On one side, Russia had just been thrown from the half-industrial world of the Tsars into the chaos of post-revolution rebuilding. On the other, waves of radical European art smashed right into the dream of a communist utopia. And from that collision came a bold idea. Architecture could actually reshape society itself. After the war and the revolution, the Russian people and the new Soviet regime shared one burning passion, the belief in a completely new life, a completely new society. Art, and especially avant-garde architecture, became the physical expression of that dream. This wasn't about pretty buildings, it was about building the nation itself. Lenin had his own taste, of course. But in the world's first socialist state, modernism wasn't just a style anymore. It was a weapon, a tool, an aesthetic and technical language to build a new society, new people, and new spaces all at once. In 1920, with Lenin's approval, Russia founded Vkhutemas, its first modern design school. But even before the school officially opened, revolutionary architects were already dreaming big. Then came 1927. Ivan Leonidov, a young Vkhutemas graduate, designed the Lenin Institute for Librarianship, an audacious paper utopia. It wasn't just a building. A towering library, a floating glass auditorium, and a suspended research block formed a single architectural constellation. So where does all of this lead? Let's look at art first. Constructivist paintings, sharp lines, pure geometry, everything feels like it's moving. Now look at the building plan. Kind of familiar, right? Same visual language, but now it actually works as a building. Offices, libraries, real usable space. And that's the shift. But when it was finally revealed, the reaction was brutal. Older Soviet architects dismissed it as a petty bourgeois fantasy, and there was a bigger problem. The country didn't even have enough glass to build 1% of it. So, like Tatlin's tower, it never left the drawing board. And that gap between radical dreams and the harsh reality defined the Soviet avant-garde. They aimed high, imagined the future, and, more often than not, crashed hard. In Moscow, the city of the future didn't last. It gave way to Stalinist monuments, imperial symmetry, and absolute control. Utopia was shelved. tradition came back. Ironically, on the very site where Ivan Leonidov had planned his audacious Lenin Institute for Librarianship, one of the grandest Stalinist buildings would eventually rise, the main building of Moscow State University, one of the famous Seven Sisters. During Lenin's time, avant-garde art enjoyed a surprising amount of freedom, and you can still see that moment frozen in Moscow today. Some of the greatest constructivist landmarks from that era are still standing. The Shukov Tower, the Rusakov Workers' Club, the Narkomfin Building, the Melnikov House, and the Zuev Workers' Club. They were bold, futuristic, sometimes even strange part of the revolution's massive cultural experiment to invent a brand new visual language for a brand new society. But Lenin himself had doubts. He worried that some of this art was drifting too far from ordinary people, too abstract, too hard to understand. He even critiqued futurist poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. Interesting, but will workers understand it? His advice was simple: go ahead and be avant-garde, but make sure the people can follow. It was practical, and it set the stage for what came next. Fast forward to Stalin. Suddenly, that same warning, too far from the people, became a hammer. It was the perfect excuse to shut down the avant-garde completely. In 1930, Vkhutemas, the legendary Soviet design school, was closed. 2 years later, Stalin personally chaired a meeting to restructure all artistic organizations. The message was clear: from now on, art exists only to build socialism. No independent groups, no experiments, just propaganda. And under Stalin, Soviet architecture took a sharp turn. Out went the experimental avant-garde. In came a new style, monumental, classical, and easy to read. But this wasn't just about buildings. Stalin wanted to remake an entire capital. In 1935, he approved a sweeping master plan to rebuild Moscow. At first, the government even invited some of the world's leading modernist architects, Le Corbusier, Hannes Meyer, Ernst May, to pitch ideas. But as the cultural climate shifted, most of their proposals were rejected. The final plan embraced a distinctly Soviet monumental classicism instead. Stalin's vision was clear: Moscow had to be the capital of socialism, a city that could stand shoulder to shoulder with Paris, London, and Berlin. To make that vision real, he approved a 3-ring radial road layout. The innermost ring, the Boulevard Ring, was built on the site of the 18th century white city walls after they were torn down. The middle ring, the Garden Ring, widened what used to be a 17th century moat road outside the old walls. There was also a plan for a third, even larger ring, but that one wasn't completed until after the war. From these rings, the city planners designed a series of wide, radiating main roads to improve traffic and make the city look grand. Tverskaya Street is a perfect example. It starts northwest of the Kremlin, cuts through the boulevard and garden rings, and stretches out toward the outskirts. Originally, it was the road to Tver, a historic rival of Moscow, but later became the main route to St. Petersburg. But roads alone weren't enough. The planners needed something even more ambitious, underground. That's when the first line of the Moscow Metro opened in 1935. And this wasn't just any subway, it was the backbone of the new city, designed to carry millions of people across the expanding capital and to showcase the power of the socialist state. Marble columns, classical arches, mosaics, chandeliers, these stations were built as underground palaces, temples of art for everyone to marvel at. Here's the paradox: cultural freedom was crushed, but the state now had unprecedented power to mobilize labor, materials, and money, and nowhere did that power show more clearly than in Moscow itself. Of course, all this building came at a cost. Huge chunks of the old city were torn down some to make way for the new roads and rings, like Sukhareva Tower, Strasnoy Convent, Simonov Monastery, and parts of the Kitaygorod Wall. Moscow was changing street by street, and with every building lost, the city itself was being rewritten. In Stalin's grand plan to reshape Moscow, one story really stands out, and it's bittersweet. Picture this. On the banks of the Moscow River once stood the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the tallest, most magnificent Orthodox church in Russia, built to celebrate victory over Napoleon in 1812. But in 1931, Stalin gave the order. It had to be blown up for ideological reasons. The Golden Dome came crashing down. Stones were hauled off to help build the metro. And on its ruins, Stalin dreamed even bigger. A skyscraper called the Palace of the Soviets, crowned with a giant Lenin statue. In the 1930s, reshaping the Moscow River wasn't just about flood control or engineering. It was deliberate, geometric, ceremonial, symbolic. The river was turned into one of Moscow's main display axes, with the Palace of the Soviets meant to stand at the very heart of that vision. The planned height was staggering 415 meters taller than the Empire State Building at the time. On top, a giant Lenin statue was meant to soar about 100 meters, with a single finger alone stretching 6 meters long. But nothing went as planned. The site was swampy and unstable. According to a blurry photo published in a 1941 newspaper, that frame of steel was all they ever managed to build the highest point it ever reached. Instead, the crater became the world's largest open-air swimming pool. For a whole generation, that surreal pool was Moscow's new landmark. Decades later, calls to rebuild the cathedral grew louder. By 1990, the city approved it, and the reconstruction was supported by donations from ordinary citizens. Some even gave family gold to help restore the domes. By 2000, the cathedral was back, as if history itself has come full circle. But Moscow's story wasn't over. In 1941, the Nazi invasion brought all grand urban plans to a halt. Then came 1945, the victory of the Great Patriotic War, and a new moment to reshape the city. But the end of the fighting didn't mean real peace. With the common enemy gone, tensions with the West were already starting to grow. And in Joseph Stalin's eyes, a showdown between socialism and capitalism wasn't just possible, it was highly likely. Moscow, he thought, needed to look the part. The Palace of the Soviets, Stalin's original plan for a single massive symbol of power, had failed. Now, the idea was different. Instead of one building, the entire skyline would showcase Soviet strength. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a massive construction campaign transformed Moscow almost overnight. 7 colossal skyscrapers rose at key points across the city, the famous Seven Sisters. But these weren't just scattered randomly. Each one was carefully placed at key intersections of Moscow's radio roads, on high points that would dominate views, all oriented around the always missing center, the Palace of the Soviets. Each tower soared over 100 meters, reshaping the skyline and towering above the church domes that had ruled the city for centuries. For the first time, secular Soviet power literally rose higher than religion. By dominating the city, they projected scale, authority, and power, making it clear to everyone, both citizens and foreigners, that the Soviet state was strong, ambitious, and here to stay. But this grand, decorative style didn't last long. In 1953, Stalin died, and Nikita Khrushchev stepped in as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, a wave of de-Stalinization swept the country. Instead of assuming war with capitalism was inevitable, Khrushchev introduced the idea of peaceful coexistence. The Soviet Union would now compete with the West not just through military strength, but by proving it could deliver a better everyday life. Architecture became the front line of that competition. Khrushchev had zero patience for Stalin's over-the-top wedding cake skyscrapers, loaded with columns, statues, and gold. To him, all that decoration was a waste of time, money, and resources. Instead, he wanted something practical, standardized, industrialized, no-frills construction. He even issued decrees banning columns, reliefs, and spires on buildings. The Kremlin Palace of Congresses is a perfect example of this new approach. If you remember the Kremlin's core area from my last video, you know it had already been shaped over centuries into a dense cluster of Moscow's oldest and most important buildings. So when the Kremlin Palace of Congresses was planned as a symbol of moving beyond the past, it had to be built right here. But take a look at this historical overlay map from 1910. There was simply no space left. Every corner was already occupied. In the end, the Soviet government made a controversial decision. Several Tsarist-era buildings were cleared away, the very ones you can see in this photo. The new palace also has strict height restrictions to match the surrounding structures. To fit 6,000 seats and all the machinery needed for big events, the architects had to dig 15 meters underground. And they used the most cutting-edge industrial materials available at the time. Khrushchev reportedly said, "This shouldn't be a Tsar's palace. It should be the people's hall." And that mindset, practical, modern, and focused on the people, defined the building from the ground up. The Cold War wasn't just a nuclear standoff, it was a competition over ways of life. If Stalin's architecture had been monuments to power, Khrushchev wanted buildings to become weapons of everyday living. The new question wasn't who looks stronger, but who lets their people live better. For Khrushchev, the future wasn't about one flashy palace. It was about millions of small, private homes for ordinary people. And the biggest obstacle standing in the way was housing. Under Stalin, most resources went to heavy industry and flashy landmark projects. Ordinary people were crammed into communal cars, shared apartments where multiple families had to split one kitchen and one bathroom. Imagine fighting your neighbors just to cook dinner. Khrushchev was furious. At a 1954 building conference, he declared, "We can't keep trading people's living conditions for a few pretty buildings. Better to build 1,000 cheap apartments than one palace nobody can live in." And just like that, the Khrushchyovka revolution began. These new apartments were usually 5 stories tall, tall enough to be functional, short enough to skip elevators. Built from prefabricated concrete panels, they were simple, boxy, and dirt cheap. People joked they looked like concrete shoeboxes printed out on a factory line. But for millions of Soviet families, these shoeboxes were a dream come true. For the first time, they had their own private kitchen and bathroom, no more sharing with strangers. In Moscow, these apartments filled what were then the city's outer districts areas that today lie roughly between the 3rd Transport Ring and the MKAD. Even today, you can still find surviving examples in districts like Northern Izmailovo, Perovo, Kuzminki, and Hovrino. In recent years, however, many of these buildings have deteriorated badly. The Moscow government launched a massive renovation program, and large numbers of Khrushchyovkas have already been demolished or are scheduled to disappear. Yet, their impact went far beyond Moscow. The Khrushchyovka became the blueprint for socialist housing across the world. From Prague to Bucharest, from Ulaanbaatar to Beijing, these grey blocks popped up everywhere. Architect Rem Koolhaas once joked, "The Khrushchyovka is like grey printer paper. It can cover any city, but it never tells their story." Sure, critics later called them ugly, soulless, and blamed them for creating concrete jungles. But in the 1950s, they symbolized something powerful, a shift from building for the state to building for the people, a Cold War weapon in the battle for living standards. But once you've mass-produced millions of identical matchbox apartments, a new question emerges. Where do you put them all? That question led to the next stage of Soviet urban thinking, a concept that would be fully developed under Leonid Brezhnev, the mikrorayon or microdistrict. In Moscow, the Khrushchyovkas were only the beginning. As the city expanded outward toward the MKAD, planners began arranging housing on a much larger scale. On the map, you can see enormous L-shaped, U-shaped, and kilometer-long slab buildings forming the structural framework of the new suburbs. If Khrushchev had solved the emergency housing shortage, Brezhnev built the permanent suburban city. These blocks weren't just thrown up randomly. Many were designed as screens shielding the inner courtyards from busy roads. Inside these protected spaces known as the dvori, you'd find courtyards, schools, kindergartens, playgrounds, and sports fields. Basically, each micro-district was its own little neighborhood, where people could live, play, and study without dodging traffic. By the 1970s, standardization had reached its limits. Tight budgets, strict rules, and a ban on decoration pushed architects in a new direction. Using concrete in increasingly experimental ways, they created bold cantilevers, twisting forms, and gravity-defying structures. What emerged was Soviet brutalism, massive buildings that looked less like traditional architecture and more like alien spacecraft. Critics sometimes call it cold romanticism, a style projecting the image of a powerful technological superpower. If you zoom in on Moscow from above, the city suddenly reveals some bizarre shapes. There's the circular roundhouse on Nezhinskaya Street, the enormous ship-like Dom Kurablь, and the futuristic Russian Academy of Sciences headquarters. What started as a desperate effort to house millions had gradually turned into something much bigger, an entire architectural landscape that looked like it belonged to the future. The strange, almost alien look of Soviet brutalism wasn't accidental. It was the space race translated into concrete. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, and the Soviet Union went wild. Suddenly, the future wasn't just on Earth, it was orbiting above. Architects started borrowing forms from rockets, radar dishes, and planetary paths, and they poured that aesthetic straight into buildings and monuments. Just 3 years later, Moscow unveiled the monument to the Conquerors of Space, a titanium-clad arc shooting into the sky. Like a rocket frozen at liftoff, titanium wasn't cheap or easy to come by, it was reserved for actual spacecraft. Using it on a monument sent a clear signal. This wasn't just a memorial, it was space itself, made tangible. By the Leonid Brezhnev era, that cosmic ambition had only grown. In 1980, the massive Yuri Gagarin Monument on Leninsky Avenue took things even further. Titanium alloy wasn't just decoration, it defined the structure itself. Sleek, industrial, almost extraterrestrial, it looked less like a statue and more like a visitor from the space age. After Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, Nikita Khrushchev famously joked, "Yuri, you didn't just go to space, you sent socialism into the cosmos." And that line says everything. These monuments were trying to send a message to the world. Socialism wasn't just about building houses, it was about conquering space. But there was a growing contradiction. The higher the monuments soared, the heavier life felt on the ground. What began as Khrushchev's housing revolution, giving people privacy, kitchens, and bathrooms, had, by the Brezhnev years, grown into vast brutalist micro-districts. Monotonous concrete megastructures swallowed individuality, and everyday life became predictable, almost uniform. The higher the monuments reached toward the stars, the more monotonous life became at street level. Extreme standardization and grand futuristic symbolism gradually collapsed into ordinary routine. Even as Moscow hit these peaks of architectural ambition, the cracks in the system were impossible to ignore. From Brezhnev's rise through the final years of the Soviet Union, this era would later be called the era of stagnation, a time when economic progress slowed, creativity dulled, and the future felt increasingly out of reach. As one critic noted, this was an age that couldn't look back aesthetically and couldn't imagine the future either. In other words, Moscow had reached for the cosmos, but life on the ground had become grounded. Then came December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union's last night. An era was over. Moscow remains the capital but no longer the capital of communism. The ideology collapsed, yet the city it built remained. Some monuments disappeared, but the spaces shaped by the Soviet project endured. From 1917 to 1991, Moscow had been rebuilt again and again. From Lenin's Avant-Garde experiments to Stalin's imperial grandeur to Khrushchev's mass housing revolution to Brezhnev's endless microrayons. Each era redesigned the city to solve its own crisis. The buildings that had once promised utopia became relics of the Cold War, part fortress, part ruin, part memory. What remained was a city filled with monuments to dreams that no longer existed. Neighborhoods built for a society that had vanished, and spaces designed for a future that never came. Some people describe Moscow as a place that feels not past enough, not future enough, pulled in two directions at once. Maybe its history isn't a straight line. Maybe it's a circle where unfinished past and unrealized future meet in the present.